Thank you. Hey, Doris's pointer still up here? Buried in all this stuff. There it is. Thank you. Yes, we're the superficial ones. Just scraping the surface of recent history. And but this is a great context for me to talk about our work because, yeah, we've set up it's a well-organized day, of course. You guys thought this through. It's not a coincidence. So I will focus in sort of greater temporal, finer temporal scale of the last 200 years, and then even more spatially focused too, as Jerry did do a little. And my approach, given all the challenging things that were just said, is obviously we have to work on the climate and do what we can as our part. And then the side that we're working on is how do we make our landscapes more resilient, have a better chance of adapting, of adjusting, of being in better shape to deal with what's going to come down the pipe, which we don't know exactly how quick or what exactly is going to happen. Is this not on? Too far down? Hold on a second. How's this? Is this any different? Sounds the same to me. Maybe I hit one of these buttons here. I'm not going to hold it. I'll put it up higher. I bet it's probably fine. Is this working better for you? Really? Is there a dial on it?
No, the volume is
Okay. Sure. Okay, well, I will just try to talk as loud as I can. So now, after the prerequisite technical difficulties, okay. I don't know. It sounds loud here. Sounds loud here. So anyways, to finish that thought, our effort in the Historical Ecology program and at the San Francisco Estuary Institute is to try to understand how our local landscapes are working, how they're responding to recent changes, and how we can make them more resilient to the changes we anticipate in the future. So I do think that's something that everyone can be involved in the next generation. And we have 20, 30, 40 years, hopefully, to make systems a lot healthier than they are today. Part of the problem is climate change. I'm talking about the ecosystem in general and all the species extinctions and challenges that are going to occur to our native flora and fauna. Part of the problem is the change, the change in extremes, the climatic variables. But also the problem is that our systems are so unresilient today. They're dealing with 1% or 5% or 2% of their natural function and extent and ability to be buffered and resilient to changes. So they're much more vulnerable today. So one thing we can do is build these systems up a little bit in the next couple of decades. And we're just starting to learn how to do that. And really just starting to do that in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, really in the last generation. And so, counter to this really negative trend, there's this positive trend of us really starting to do big things on the landscape to make it work significantly better. And we hit, I think as Andy will talk about a little later, we kind of hit a low in the environment in a lot of ways in the 70s and now are bringing back significant components of wetlands and rivers, etc. Anyway, so that's my context. So I'm going to have three parts to the talk. The first is about the historical bay. It's that most recent bay that Doris talked about and Jerry talked about. And one of the things you could see from the way they discussed it is it's the only bay, I'm pretty sure, right, that people have known. Those earlier ones, nobody was here. So it's the bay that we inherited as people, that people came to live around. It's the only one we've known. Inherited isn't really the right word because we really took it from the people who live here. The native tribes, the 50 or so individual separate language tribes that lived around the bay. And now we have, so what I'm going to look at today then is what it was, how we've changed it and modified it over those past 2 centuries, and then some of the themes or ideas about how we can and are starting to respond. So this is the map we made that shows the historical, time of gold rush, circa 1800 landscape. And once the bay came up, started to come up 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and then it started to stabilize 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, and these wetlands built around the edge in green. And so you built 200,000 acres of tidal marshland. And around the edges of those, you had tidal flats, and you had shallow bay, much like today, and deeper waters in this blue. And you had a whole lot of complexity in here. And that's what we started to discover and learn and try to understand as we try to bring back pieces of that system. By the way, these are the tribal names up here. The Huchun and the Jurgen and the Tubun. These are all different tribes around the estuary from Randy Milliken's reconstructions. So I'll zoom into some spots in old maps just to give you a flavor of that. These are the maps that I sort of first fell in love with as an ecologist to drag me into history, which seemed like a really boring topic to me, being a scientist, but it turned out to be fascinating. And I've spent the last 17 years doing historical scientific research. So these are the T-sheets, the coast survey maps of the coast of the bay. These are made for the whole country. They did our area in the 1850s. And they show the channels, tidal channels. All of this area is tidal marsh. This is more the open bay. These are large channels that you can bring boats up, and they come into landings. And in fact, much of today's road network is still oriented to come to these landings, because those are the only way to get through the marshes, because they were really a barrier between the land and the water. So you would take, in fact, many of the exits off 880 are still Mowry's Landing or Mowry's Road, Beards, Mayhew's. So these things actually set the course of many of our roads. You notice we don't have such a grid around the East Bay or the South Bay. A lot of weird angles. That's a lot of what that is, even though the landings only lasted 10 or 20 years until the railroad came in, sort of makes them superfluous. And so there's a big channels maintained by the tidal flows, and then many smaller channels branching off. And then in the back, you can see these large ponds. These were called salinas by the Spanish, and they were salt was naturally evaporated in them in the late summer. And they were harvested by native peoples and then by the Spanish, and then they turned into the whole salt industry that ended up sort of taking over this whole landscape, what was originally based on the naturally salt-producing salinas of the bay margin.
Where is this located?
Sorry, this is Coyote Hills right here. These are the same Coyote Hills. The park is sort of right around here. So this is in the in the Fremont area. The bridge, the Dumbarton, comes across right like this. And here's just going a little further north. This is the northern part of the Coyote Hills. Alameda Creek, Engineer Channel comes through right here. And just so you can see Union City, here's a landing on Alameda Creek where the historical route came through. These are large ponds. You see the complexity of the channel system. Huge productivity for fisheries, waterfowl, shorebirds, all kinds of species living in there. And then zooming in even more, the detail on these maps is fairly remarkable and has generated sort of a whole field of inquiry in a way throughout coastal California and the country because of how much you can see. Remember, these are people out there in the marsh themselves with no aerial photography or GPS, mapping all of these channels and little ponds down to the size of channels you could walk across. So a tremendously rich pattern and landscape. A little further north is the most famous salt pond, which was called Crystal Salt Pond. This is in the Hayward area. San Leandro's right up here in San Lorenzo. So it was a huge natural feature sort of from a wave-built berm out here that backed up water and made a 1,000-acre natural salt evaporating pond that really is sort of what the original salt pond industry expanded from. Now, so we were looking just right down in this little corner at some neat things. And those patterns of ponds and channel continue throughout all of these large wetland systems in the North Bay and the South Bay and Sassoon, with varying patterns that we've been able to understand are vary in part because of the salinity. You see different patterns up here where you have larger ponds and slightly different vegetation mixes, but so you see variations on that general theme. But then one of the differences in the Central Bay, where we are today, is you got smaller marshes because you had steeper topography in general and more wave action, and there were a lot of beaches. This is one thing that came as a surprise to us, that the bay had 27 miles of beaches, mostly all in this area. In fact, much of the shoreline was lined with beach. And those were, of course, lost due to fill, and then they used as materials for construction. But I'll zoom in on what those look like a little bit. Here's one of the ways we know is that these little fringes right here, this is the East Bay. Here's San Pablo, Old Road. Here's Albany Hill. This one is Strawberry Creek. So the campus would be right up here. This is the bay. IKEA is like right here. This is a key large blue landmark. This is where Golden Gate Fields is, out here. So you can see these are beaches from there to there, from there to there, all along here, along the shoreline, and they were actually appreciated and enjoyed and used as such. I mean, they have a lot of clothes on it. It's not Southern California, but still it was a nice spot to go, especially people coming over to the East Bay from San Francisco and Ocean View, that West Berkeley was called. So it was a nice place to go, and the beaches were actually appreciated. And some of them, this is a 1907 picture, some of them lasted through into the 40s and 50s. That's Albany Hill right there, so people may be able to really picture where this is. And there's a tidal marsh here behind the beach, which is one interesting observation that I'll come back around to at the end. That the beach is actually protecting the marsh from erosion. You can see, as Adora said, the landscape we know, and this is our plebeian, everyday, workaday landscape that I'm talking about. And so we see all of these things every day, but so much is invisible, is just beneath the surface, or just not that easy to see. So I find it fascinating to discover the remnant features and the sort of muted processes that still are often relatively intact. They're just hard to see. So, for example, here's that shoreline, that arc, that wave-cut arc, and that's this line right here in the East Bay. Right? So this little hill here at Golden Gate Fields is that island right there. And so Golden Gate Fields is kind of smartly designed in a way. They use that to get the, to build up the spectator viewing, stands, the grandstands. Take advantage of that. And then you can see the shape right through here. And then Aquatic Park, as many people may know, was originally the shoreline, the back edge. And so the freeway was put out in the mudflats. I guess that was pretty much the only place left at that point. So this is probably unfortunate, all this stuff out here, given sea level rise. This was a nice little berm, a little cliff, that would have been probably a good place to stop, thinking about coming sea level rise. And in fact, you can see that cliff when you look, as I really shouldn't be doing, driving on 80 here. It's still right here. So this is the berm, or sort of wave-cut little cliff that's still the back edge of this. Still the back edge here. And the ocean, of course, came up to here, the bay, and waves lapped up against there. It may well do so in the not too distant future. Now, one of the important questions and themes. Right? Oh, it's not. So. Okay, is this working better now? I know you'd think I was whispering up here or something. I mean, usually I don't have a mic, and it's not a problem. So one of the important things that Jerry hinted at is that marshes naturally have to move inland because the seas have been rising for a long time, and the way they deal with that is they just move inland. And most of the bay had these kind of transitions to the land. Very low elevation, flat, grassy swales, wildflower meadows. And those worked out well because the sea could just, the marshes could gradually creep up into the lowlands. So that was mostly what we had. This is, again, looking at Albany Hill. This is an 1861 photograph by Carlton Watkins, very early. In fact, that's the little hill the Golden Gate Fields is built upon. And so you had these wildflower meadows. These are the California poppies. Too bad this isn't in color, but you can imagine. This is the Richmond Plain. So these gradual slopes coming down to the edge of the bay. And that's created part of our problem, is that we followed those all the way down to the edge of the bay and even further. Some places had a little bit of a different characteristic going into the upland. This is Oakland, which had a unique area of oaks, of course, and the dense grove of oaks down here right at the edge of the marsh. And you don't see that in too many places around the bay. It's pretty rare. Usually it was really an open landscape. You could see for miles. You could see across the bay. But down here you had this dense habitat, and it was due to the sands that blew over geologically into this area and build a specific habitat type there. And there's even paintings of that in the early, I think that's 1870s or so. Fifth and Harrison, something like that. And I actually am not talking about this in this talk, but one of the things that we are pointing out that we could do to improve the landscape is bring back a lot of the oak trees, which are relatively drought and xeric tolerant. And actually, there's no reason not to have them scattered through much of our lowland valleys throughout the state. They were removed mostly for agriculture, for orchards, and now they're suburbs now. And we actually would like the shade back. It wouldn't compete with orchards. So we have a whole project called Re-Oaking to try to bring oaks back. So here's just another edge of the estuary, Lake Merritt, of course. People think of it as a lake, but it really was a big part of the, it was well connected to the estuary. So that dot right there, where Telegraph and San Pablo split, okay, is there. And the thing that I'm always struck by is it's still connected to the bay, but it's a super tiny, thin little connection. It's like a tenth of what it was. And here's what, you see how wide that is. So huge tidal flows in and out. And of course, one of the challenges with the Lake Merritt now is that it gets all this pollution from the hills, and it has nowhere to go. So it would have been much better flushed historically. The other thing about it that one doesn't notice walking around it is it had these fingers of marsh going up each of the drainages. So it's kind of like a hand that all the fingers were chopped off. So it's still a wonderful feature, of course, in an urban area, but it's lost a lot of its function. So this is the kind of detail that we develop in careful mapping of the landscape from those maps, showing tidal channels and ponds. And these have actually been useful for restoring specific salt pond islands and figuring out both what kind of patterns we aim for, and then actually using some of these same channels to re-engineer how the tides come in. It's kind of remarkable. You know, I don't take history that literally. We're trying to learn more of the patterns and processes. But in some places, we're actually using the same exact channel that was lost, that was cut off 100 years ago, because it's still unconsolidated sediment. And people found that if we designed a pretty new channel that sort of as a tabula rasa, that would capture it, and the flows would just get diverted down it. So it's best to use the old one because it's still there. You can mess up the historical landscape, but you can never really get rid of it. It's always buried or still there in some shape or form. So some of the things that we've learned about the bay landscape through historical research in the last decade is that their tidal marshes are much more than just these pickleweed plains. We have such small pieces left that we just thought of them as somewhat homogeneous areas of salt-tolerant plants. But they had a lot more going on in them. And we're starting to see that as we bring back larger marshes. Tidal channels, the pans, the salinas, beaches on the margins as upland transition. So these have all become things we're working to restore now in projects around the bay. So second part is shoreline change. And the subtitle of my talk that I was going to mention is sort of getting to know the shoreline. And my overall message about that is that, you know, we've modified the shoreline and it appears to be somewhat static and, you know, designed as consciously designed, but really it's not. It's sort of a hodgepodge array of things that were done at different times. And a lot of changes have been happening over the past 50 years, 100 years, that we haven't necessarily kept track of. And it's going to change a lot in the next 50 years or 100 years. So the question is, are we going to understand our shoreline well enough to be part of that change? Is it just going to happen to us, or are we going to do some smart things on the shoreline that actually guide how it changes over the next few decades? So one way to get a feel for that is to look back at the last 100 years. So the obvious thing that people know is the big change in wetlands in terms of diking and filling of the bay. And that's from that picture to this. So you can see the loss of a lot of green. That's the tidal marsh fragmentation and loss, 85% worth. And then the other kinds of things that came in, these are the diked farmlands of the North Bay and the duck clubs, in large part of Sassoon, and the salt ponds of the North Bay and down through much of the South Bay. And then the purple is bay fill. You see there's a lot of bay fill in the center of the bay, the Oakland ports and airports and San Francisco, Foster City. But fill actually is only 10%. 10% of the bay was filled. That's never what you hear from the environmental statement. It sounds more like 90% of it was filled. But if it was 90% filled, it would be just a little thing. It would have been if the River Plan had gone through and activism hadn't saved the bay. But actually the bay has been largely protected in the middle. What happened is that a tremendous amount of diked area. So that means it's like Holland, right? Small little walls, relatively speaking, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 feet tall, keeping the tides out. So that's pretty interesting because it means these areas are not above tide level. In fact, some of them are below because they've sunk or subsided. But it means that they're all potentially within the range of the tides, which is exciting for tidal marsh restoration. And it's also problematic for sea level rise. But they are really still part of the bay system, even though they're all cut off, at least potentially. So one of the interesting things to note is that the bay, this is one of the good ways to look at the bay is it had these deeper waters in the middle, and then it had this really shallow area in the marshes and the tidal flats. Like they would really recede in and out of being underwater from a really high tide to a low tide. And it was about 50-50. So you had areas that were always water, and then you had the intertidal zone, which was almost as big as the whole open water portion of the bay. And now what we have is the open bay portion, the blue, is almost the same size. It's only gone down a little bit. But we lost most of the edge. So the bay has gone from, it had this deeper portion in the middle, which itself is fairly shallow, 18 feet on average. But then it had a really shallow area on the edge that was, you know, basically at sea level, was within a few feet. And that's what we've lost. So we've turned the bay into sort of a bathtub where the water just goes up and down, whereas historically it would go in and out, you know, laterally. It would, you know, these big lungs kind of going in and out, pulsing water in and out of the marshes. Now it just sort of goes up, it goes down. So that's the big change. And so you can think, Doris said that 18 feet average for the bay now, historically, it probably would have been about half of that. The average would have been much, much smaller. So we're really left with the deeper portions of the bay. And that's kind of a bummer for most of the species, many of the species that depend upon the bay. A lot of the productivity came from those edges. So how did this happen? One of the big things I mentioned was salt ponds, and people know about that, but this shows some of the history. This started up here where those natural ponds were in the 1850s. These areas were diked in the later 19th century, and then kind of expanded down here. And some of these areas down here near San Jose were diked only in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, which is kind of interesting and almost unfortunate in a certain way, because that allowed them to be exposed to huge amounts of mercury deposition in the mines down there. So we actually find more mercury down here in those because they were open, bizarrely enough. On the other hand, a positive thing about that is that we got to see how they responded to subsidence. They subsided because of groundwater. I don't know if people know about this, but the whole ground down here sank because of too much water being withdrawn for Santa Clara Valley agriculture in the 20th century. And it sank several feet within several decades. So a pretty fast rate of sea level rise. In fact, faster than a lot of the current predictions. Not the worst possible. And these kept pace with sea level. So it shows that it's possible for our marshes to grow up pretty darn fast if they have the sediment and the circulation patterns that they need. And I'll come back to that. Another little example of the dynamics of the bay shoreline. I love this one. Got into a little more detail than usual. Bull Island is up here in the Napa Marshes. Why don't I show you where that is? So way up here. So, our pictures of 1800 and 2000, they really mask a lot of the interesting complexity that happened in between, how we got from point A to point B. So Bull Island was a marsh in the middle along Napa River in 1858. And then by about 15 or 20 years later, it had been diked off, and people were farming winter wheat and rye out there and doing quite well with it. And then that kind of faded. That wasn't such a big industry. And it went fallow for 20 or 30 years in the first half of the 20th century. And then, but the dikes held, the levees held, and then the family got back into it and started growing potatoes for 5 or 10 years. And that was a big productive crop, red Pontiac potatoes, out here in the marshlands. But then 1955 and 1958 had big floods. The levees broke. Salt built up. This is a 1940 image. Salt built up on the landscape, and it was too expensive to maintain the levees. So it went through this whole trajectory of tidal marsh to agricultural land to sort of nature coming back and breaking down the levees and turning it back into a salt marsh, and then people just giving up on it, reverting back to marshland. Do I have the next picture? Yeah. And reverting back to marshland, the old channels reoccupying themselves, the family selling it to the land trust, and now it's a fish and game preserve. You've gone the full cycle all the way back. And a lot of that theme is happening around the edge of the bay. Things that were tried out worked for a decade or two, or even 5 or 6, and just didn't work in the long run. These areas were duck clubs, and that produced a ton of mosquitoes, and then you had to ditch them. And then the levees had to be maintained, and then big floods came down, knocked out the levees. And now we're restoring many of these marshlands actually to provide flood control, to reduce flooding upstream in the city of Napa. So all of these sort of failed enterprises, or things that made sense for a few decades, don't make as much sense now. In that area, it kind of works best as the function that it had historically was as a natural floodplain, flood flow dissipation. So it's pretty interesting. I think about that we're still learning about this landscape. We as a culture have only been here for 150 years. We're still trying to calibrate ourselves to what makes sense. We came in mostly without a Mediterranean adapted knowledge base, try to apply a lot of East Coast ideas, try to make some landscapes be things that they really can't support in the long run, and we're starting to adapt to it, perhaps. So this summarizes that. Here's the marshlands. Here's that Bull Island. Here's the whole overall Napa River marshlands in 1800. In 1978, which was kind of a low point, just small fragments. And then pretty much now, when we've actually, let me go back to 1978, you can see there's actually substantially more green already that has been restored. It's out of marshland. And then all the light green has already been opened up to the tides and will hopefully turn itself into marsh over the next 5 or 10 years. And then these areas are a little hard to see. There's some more whitish area, this color. Jeez. I guess that's like this. A lot more areas are actually in planting. So this trend, you can see, would bring this area back to almost 50% of what we had historically. Yes, this white thing is the Napa River. So the city of Napa is up here. Mare Island is right here. Vallejo is right here. So this as a microcosm is a pretty fascinating reversal of trends, a real societal change in how we use these shoreline habitats. Pretty remarkable transformation. Here's an example of one of these restored marshes, the one right at the top, right there in the city of Napa, done by the county. And here it is in 1858. Here it is in 1940. Pretty unrecognizable. This is the historical shape. You say, it's not there. You would never know it had been there. And we actually gave these maps to the Flood Control Agency when they were designing this project to give them some guesstimate as where the tides would go when it was opened up. And here's what came back. It just nailed it. Turns out that guy knew what he was doing, that surveyor in 1858. And the landscape hasn't really changed that much. And in fact, there's some ponds that were right through here that I think are actually coming back as well. So I told them recently, you know, if you don't get vegetation in that spot right through here, don't consider that a failure. It looks like that feature is actually coming back, and even more so in some recent Google Earth imagery. So it's pretty amazing, you know, on the other side, how resilient natural processes are. You know, we have these global impacts and these intensive impacts, but we're also operating within, you know, we've only been here 150 years. We haven't screwed up everything yet. How's that for optimism? So here's another neat example. Tidal Marsh, this is what I call that IKEA marsh out here. You know, the landfill comes out to more here now. This is Emeryville. So that's a nice marsh that had a channel, smaller channels, ponds along the back edge, scattered across the plain. That's completely filled, gone, history toast. But what's right here now, a little triangle right here, is this, Emeryville Crescent. Same kinds of ponds, formed since 1900, scattered across the marsh plain, same species, same plants. I mean, pretty much all the same elements right there along the freeway when you get on the exit. And willow groves that were on the edge, I forgot to point that out. That's a willow grove, a willow marsh right there, where springs were at the edge of the bay. Those are often shell mound sites and indigenous village areas. Big part of the system. Willows on the edge. And then just downslope, here's a beach that came back. You know, the old beach was over here, and it's just reestablished itself a few hundred feet out towards the bay where the right conditions exist. And the shoreline itself has been very dynamic. And that's one of the things that is interesting, because we're concerned that, as Jerry mentioned, we're going to lose our marshes because the sea level is going to rise, and we're already seeing some erosion. So one project we've just started is looking at how variable those trends are around the bay. And you see this over the long term. Like in 1850s, this area has built out. It's actually built up marsh since 1850s. This area has eroded. They kind of balance each other out right here. We're interested in understanding how is the shoreline responding to trends of sea level rise and changes in sediment at different scales around the edge of the bay. Here's a little more detail at the mouth of San Francisco Creek in Palo Alto. Stanford's right down here. I don't know if that's okay to say. It's as a reference point. So shoreline here, 1850, 1897, 1921. You can see a substantial trend of erosion here. It's pretty consistent. So it's eroding back as seas rise, as waves erode the edge, and perhaps as there's less sediment supply to the marshes. But that trend reverses a bit right here, or it slows down near this protrusion of fill. And it also is a little different here where the creek mouth is, where sediment was presumably coming out at certain times. So we'd like to understand the different segments of the shoreline and how they respond so that we can manage them most proactively. Look for areas with positive trends that are not eroding as fast or that are actually accreting now. And maybe those are where we focus some of our preservation and restoration efforts. So that gets into our response, the third part. And there's a lot of ways we're exploring responding, and Will Travis will talk about those probably a bit more. And his agency is doing a lot of the exciting work on that. So if we look at the bay, one of the things to note, so here's the here's the historical bay shape, and here's the projected 1.4 meter sea level rise. So this is still the standard planning horizon that's come out of USGS and is being adopted by the agencies. And it's and it may be modest compared to what could happen and what will probably happen over a longer time period. But this is a projection of 1.4 meters by 2100. And the remarkable thing is, it's basically so similar to the historical bay. So the first lesson is the historical bay is going to come back. You know, that was a short-lived endeavor to try to go out there. Unless we build huge levees around all of these areas, it would be incredibly expensive for areas that are not that economically vital to the estuary, to the economics of the region. So most of the problem was moving into the bay. But then again, there are the devil's in the details. And it does go, if you look here and down here in the South Bay, you'll see that red goes quite a bit further than the historical bay margin did. And down here, it's particularly because, again, that subsidence. Big mistake taking out all that water in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. It sank all this area of the South Bay, and it's going to make it really tough to protect it from sea level rise. It happens to have a lot of high-rent activities down there like Yahoo and Google, who are virtual, but they do need a place. They actually do have a physical location, and that is in the last developed area of the South Bay, which is down there. So some of the ideas that are coming through that are triggered by some of the historical findings are interesting. One is the recognition of the bay's beaches. And this is a map produced by Audubon, I think last year, based on our data, but we didn't produce it. They've started developing a campaign to look at maybe bringing back some of the bay's beaches. They supported a lot of native plants, rare and endangered plants, potentially breeding habitat for snowy plover, a very endangered bird species. And then also, even more interesting in a way, is realizing that they had some wave attenuation to the shoreline erosion protection capacity as these natural barriers that existed around the edge of many of our marshes. So this red is the beaches that we show were there historically. I mentioned 27 miles of beach in Central Bay. The yellow, a little hard to see, are beaches that came back just of their own accord in particular spots. And then the idea is you might be able to bring back some beaches using dredged sediment like this one that actually has picked up I'm forgetting the name of the species now, sea blight, I think. A rare species has come back on this. This is one of the trial projects that Peter Bay has led and has shown some success. So, An interesting strategy is looking at beaches and then also oyster beds, maybe even eelgrass beds, some of the things that made our shoreline a little rougher, a little tougher, but in a soft engineering approach. This is going to be one of the challenges, of course, is how much engineering do we do, how much can we use natural landscape characteristics, and then keep some of the health of the edge of the marsh. So we're looking at some of these models and exploring how they can work. Another one is this interesting thing. So Jerry hinted at this, that marshes have to rise or move inland. And they can rise as long as they can grow fast enough to keep up with the sea levels increase. And that's both vegetative growth, and they can just grow up with the sea. But they also need sediment to really grow fast. So if they get mud and they can capture that, it's in the water, they can grow remarkably fast and keep up. They have more ability to be resilient and adaptive to sea level rise. Now, it turns out that people knew this 100 years ago in the bay. And so they were using this practice of diverting streams, which is where the sediment comes from, into the marshlands. Not to save the marshes, but actually to fill them so they could farm them. To get them actually above the sea so it was more alluvial and you could farm it. But it's a very interesting practice that is equivalent to what we're now starting to do. We're starting to realize that we need that sediment that's coming into the bay, and we would like to have it going to the marshes that we would like to preserve. And that people knew this a century ago, and we've ignored it for a while. And now we realize that sediment's really valuable. So rapid sedimentation at San Francisco and Alameda for reclaiming the salt marsh. We build a levee around a certain portion, allow the floodwaters to spread over it, and drop the sediment at the desired place. And here's an example. Stevens Creek, which goes through Mountain View, comes out into the bay here, or the marshes. They call it a farm reclamation area. And here's a map. That was like, what year was that? That was, I think, 1870s, 80s. And then this is 1897, and you can see this channel is built out, a little delta of sediment into the marshland. So it's had a zone of effect. So one of the things we can do is look back at the things we've done to the shoreline and how the shoreline responded in terms of thinking about what our strategies are for the future. And a couple projects we're involved in, I'll close on, start using some of these ideas. This is a project that Phil Williams Associates is doing, is designing for the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority that manages that creek I mentioned that comes through Palo Alto. So there were all these marshlands in the 1850s. They're mostly gone now in favor of a golf course. And there's a little bit of marsh right here. That's the marsh I showed was eroding fairly rapidly. And so the idea now is to actually, the creek now goes by the marshes, is diverted out to the bay, but actually to connect it back to its marshland. So that when it does bring sediment out, it can flow into the marshland and be kept where we would like it, instead of dissipating it out into the bay where we don't really know where it'll end up. So then that may help provide other habitats, transitional, freshwater to brackish habitats. So there's some potential there. And then this is another project at an even bigger scale that is still in sort of conceptual discussion on Alameda Creek in the Hayward, Newark area, Union City. And so this is a project, a lot of people are involved in Alameda Creek. Alameda Creek is the biggest watershed in the Bay Area. It's bigger than Napa River. And it had steelhead, a lot of, and salmon. And there's salmon steelhead still trying to get up the creek, but don't make it up. There's a lot of interest and attention to what could be done to improve Alameda Creek. And one of the ideas out there is to restore its estuary, i.e. its connection to the bay and the marshlands. So this is an aerial. Union City's up here. Where's 880? 880 is like through like this. So you might see Alameda Creek, this big flood control channel that you cross when you're driving south or north. There's Coyote Hills again. So this is what we're in process on this project, reconstructing what this landscape looked like, how it worked. And so these are kind of raw, but what we're finding is that Alameda Creek was a huge Well, everyone knows this is a huge alluvial cone of sediment coming out of the canyon. The river would go back and forth and built up a cone of sediment. But it's fairly remarkable how, even in historical times, it flowed in multiple directions. This was the main channel, but it overflowed this way, and much of its flow went like this, also across this Crandall Slough, and created a really high groundwater landscape here with willow marshes and side channels. It probably was really productive for steelhead rearing habitat as they're coming out of the stream and fattening themselves up before they go out to be little fish with all the other big fish. It's one of the biggest issues in steelhead survival is how big they are when they go out. So often we get steelhead going out of systems, but they're too small and they don't survive very well. So fattening them up on the way out is a big issue. And this is probably one of the major engines for how that happened. And you think, well, that's not recoverable, right? That's all toast. You saw the picture. That's not coming back. But I'm fairly impressed with some of the conversations I'm hearing and being part of with the county flood control. That's ours. If you live in Berkeley, that's Alameda County Flood Control. And the other agencies, this Coastal Conservancy and others that are involved in this project. And they're playing around with the idea that you could potentially restore this portion of the channel because it's actually still there. It's just disconnected. It has never been filled. It actually has trees along it. It's just sort of a dead, abandoned channel. And then also down here, we're restoring these marshes, the Eden Landing marshes. But there's concern about sediment, right? We're going to restore all 1,000 acres of marshland, 2,000 acres, but is it just going to then drown as sea level rises? Well, at the same time, we have a sediment problem in the flood control channel right here. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have to be spent to remove dirt that doesn't make it out to the bay. It causes a flooding hazard. So the idea, if you can see, here's the contemporary flood control channel, comes through like this, is to actually remove, whoops, let me go back here, remove this levee in part or substantially over here so that, and put a new levee back here to protect the buildings, the suburbs, and let the river spread out into this area. So that would deliver the sediment from Alameda Creek, if it works out well and we can model it and it actually plays out, and everyone agrees, we can bring the sediment of Alameda Creek into the marshlands as it normally did before. It would create many of the transitional wetland habitats on the edge that salmon, that steelhead are looking for. And then if you connect this too, you have a safer route out. Because this, the fish just get munched and it's too hot in this big open channel. This has the cover and the hiding spots that little steelhead need. So that's a pretty remarkable example, I think, of the kind of accommodation of natural processes and native species that can happen within a developed landscape and that we're starting to realize could be done. And it's not bringing back the historical landscape, of course. It's not even probably 50% of it, but it's maybe 10%, and we have 1% now. So I look at that and I think that's 1,000% increase. Just thinking conceptually, if you can get back to a significant fraction of historical function, you're improving the habitat for those species by an incredible amount. And I see these kind of opportunities throughout the Bay Area and the Delta and coastal California in general. They take some effort, but they also solve problems too. We'd like to have the marshes out here because we'd rather have the bay out here than right here lapping against these homes, right? That's what New Orleans lost, is having the marshes as a buffer. And we have this sediment problem right here. So we put the sediment where we want it. So, as somewhat of an optimistic direction. And then I will close on a couple, just a little slide sequence here, right near us of this Fleming Point where Golden Gate Fields is. This comes and goes. So here's an 1890s map showing the marsh and that little Point Fleming Island. Here's Cordonices Creek. Here's West Berkeley. Here's Strawberry Creek. There's the edge of the campus right here. So we're like right there. So it's a map that's late enough that you can kind of recognize where you are because of the roads, but it's early enough that the marshes are still there. That's 1898 or so. It's USGS, kind of first generation USGS, as opposed to the Geologic Survey as opposed to the Coast Survey. And then here's our habitats that we would then map from sources like this. There's that island, there's the marsh. Here's the contemporary landscape. Back. And then here is a projected just 1.4 meters of sea level rise, the red. So that's a challenge. You see, it's largely the areas, I mean, most of this actually is the bay fill portion, but it does definitely come into a lot of areas that have a lot of things going on. So that's to sort of set it up for the second half of the day that I think is going to talk about more how we respond to sea level rise. So yeah, and there's it all kind of overlaid together, and you can see the red areas of sea level rise, which are actually more continuous than is shown here. It's just the way that the modeling works out. But you kind of take the highest line, that's where it's going to go, with just the 1.4 meters. So and I'll stop there. Thank you.